12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships. 2 million died before even reaching America. For over 250 years, laws written in ink and enforced with whips stripped every right, turning human beings into property with no hope of justice or escape. The daily brutality was unimaginable. Hours of labor that broke bodies, deliberate starvation, families torn apart in moments, all legally protected. The truth is, you wouldn't last 24 hours in black slavery times because the system wasn't just cruel. It was engineered to destroy you. What made survival in that world possible for some? And why would it remain out of reach for anyone today? The transatlantic slave trade operated on a scale that defies comprehension. Over 12 million African men, women, and children were forced onto ships bound for the Americas between the early 1500s and the end of the 19th century. Of those, nearly 2 million perished before reaching land, their bodies discarded into the Atlantic, casualties of disease, starvation, and violence. The survivors arrived in the New World not as people, but as cargo, counted, priced, and insured against loss. In August 1619, a Dutch vessel anchored off Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying about 20 Africans. This landing marked a quiet beginning to a system that would become central to the colonial economy. Shipping logs from British and Portuguese captains recorded their human cargo by weight and number, with mortality rates sometimes reaching 20% per crossing. Merchants factored these deaths into their ledgers as spoilage, no different from rotted grain or broken tools. Once ashore, Africans were auctioned to the highest bidder. Children as young as 5 stood naked beside adults, examined like livestock. The price of a healthy young man in Virginia could fetch the equivalent of a year's wages for a skilled English laborer. The economic logic was stark. A single enslaved person could produce many times their purchase price in tobacco or sugar within a few years. The legal language that developed in the colonies reflected this commodification. By the early 18th century, colonial statutes described enslaved people as real estate, heritable, mortgageable, and transferable like land. In the eyes of the law, a person became an asset to be used as collateral for loans or divided among heirs. The Virginia General Assembly's 1705 Slave Code made this explicit, stating that all slaves would descend to heirs, according to the manner and custom of land of inheritance. The scale of this system transformed the Atlantic world. By 1750, the value of enslaved people in the British colonies rivaled the value of all land and buildings combined. Ships left Liverpool and Bristol packed with trade goods, returned months later with gold, ivory, and, most profitably, human beings. The profits fueled the rise of port cities and underwrote the wealth of planters from Charleston to Barbados. Each transaction reduced a life to a line on a balance sheet. The forced movement of millions, the deaths at sea, and the relentless drive for profit laid the foundation for a system in which people were not only bought and sold, but bred, mortgaged, and inherited, property in the most literal sense. This was the economic engine that powered the rise of the plantation South, and it began with the transformation of human beings into cargo. In the early 18th century, Virginia's lawmakers crafted statutes that did not merely regulate slavery. They engineered a legal architecture designed to erase personhood entirely. The 1705 Virginia Slave Code declared that enslaved people would be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate, making their lives legally indistinguishable from land or livestock. This was no technicality. It meant that a human being could be mortgaged, seized for debt, or divided among heirs, just as one might parcel out an acre of tobacco field. For planters, this classification ensured that enslaved people descended with property, consolidating wealth and power within elite families. For the enslaved, it stripped away any notion of legal selfhood. The law's reach was total. Enslaved people could not testify against whites, own property, or enter contracts. Teaching a slave to read was a criminal act in most southern states. Movement required written permission, and any attempt to flee could lead to mutilation or execution. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 extended this legal straitjacket across state lines, compelling even free states to return escapees on the mere word of a claimant. Local patrols in states like North Carolina were granted authority to search homes, detain suspects, and enforce curfews, creating a climate of constant surveillance. Legal impunity was not an accident, it was policy. The case of Celia, a teenager enslaved in Missouri, exposes the legal machinery at its most chilling. In 1855, after years of sexual assault by her owner, Celia killed him in self-defense. At trial, her lawyers argued she had the right to resist rape under Missouri law. Judge William Hall refused to let the jury consider this defense, instructing them that the law did not protect an enslaved woman's virtue. Celia was convicted and hanged at age 19. Her case made clear: the law recognized no right of self-defense, no claim to bodily autonomy, and no protection from violence for the enslaved. The codes were enforced not just by courts, but by ordinary citizens deputized as slave patrols. These groups had the power to enter any home, stop any black person on the road, and administer punishment without due process. The legal system did not merely permit abuse, it demanded it, ensuring that no enslaved person could appeal to the courts for protection, no matter the crime. The law's design was absolute: to turn human beings into property, and to ensure that property could never claim the rights of the living. The day began before the sun breached the horizon, as the clanging of the plantation bell jolted every man, woman, and child from thin sleep. In the Deep South's cotton fields, the work was not just relentless, it was weaponized. Each enslaved person was assigned a quota: 150 pounds of cotton, sometimes 200, to be picked and weighed by nightfall. Failure meant the cowskin whip. Overseers patrolled with it coiled at their side, the threat as constant as the southern heat. Frederick Douglass, who spent his youth on Maryland plantations, recalled the whip's sting in words that still burn. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. For Douglass, and for thousands like him, the day's labor was a gauntlet. The cowskin whip, made from dried oxhide, could cut flesh to the bone with a single blow. A blow with it, on the hardest back, will gash the flesh and make the blood start, he wrote. The sound of it, air whistling, then the snap, became the rhythm of the fields. Work did not pause for age or condition. Children as young as 7 were put to picking. Pregnant women bent over rows until the day they gave birth, then returned with wounds still raw. The pace was dictated by the overseer's ledger. Each basket was weighed at dusk, every shortfall tallied. If a worker picked more than their quota, the new weight became their baseline. The system punished both failure and success, driving bodies beyond exhaustion, robbing every ounce of strength. The fields themselves were a hazard. Cotton bolls tore skin, leaving hands raw and bleeding. Insects swarmed, the southern sun blistered necks and backs, and the air was thick with dust. There was no break, no shade, no relief, only the knowledge that a missed quota meant the whip, and too many missed quotas meant worse. Douglass described the exhaustion that followed. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the cheerful spark died. The dark night of slavery closed in on me. This was not labor as most would know it. It was a daily ordeal designed to break the will as much as the body, enforced by violence and fear. In the Cotton South, the day did not end when the sun went down. but only when the last pound was weighed, the last lash struck, and the fields fell silent but for the sound of breathing, ragged but alive for another dawn. Noon brought no relief from the fields, only a shift in suffering. The cabins assigned to enslaved families were built for containment, not comfort, windowless, dirt-floored, and barely large enough for a dozen people to crowd together at night. Archaeological digs at former plantations reveal these spaces sometimes measured less than 200 square feet, with as many as 10 or 12 people sharing each cramped room. Straw pallets or rags on the floor served as beds. Furniture was a rarity. A single battered pot or handmade cup might be the only personal possession. The air inside was thick and stale, especially in summer, and the walls offered little protection from cold or rain in winter. Clothing was rationed to 1 or 2 sets per year, coarse and threadbare, leaving children and adults alike exposed to the elements. Food rations were measured for survival, not nourishment. Cornmeal and salt pork scraps made up the bulk of the diet, distributed weekly in quantities just enough to keep people working, but not enough to stave off hunger. Some enslaved people risked punishment to hunt at night or tend secret gardens, but many went to sleep hungry. Medical care was almost non-existent. Injuries from the fields, infections, and chronic illnesses were often ignored unless they threatened a person's ability to work. When so-called treatment did arrive, it could be as dangerous as the ailment. Dr. J. Marion Sims, now called the father of gynecology, used enslaved women as experimental subjects in Alabama. His surgical notes describe how he operated on women like Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, sometimes performing more than a dozen procedures on the same woman, always without anesthesia. Sims wrote that Lucy nearly died from blood poisoning after one such operation, yet he continued his experiments, believing black women felt less pain. Harriet Jacobs, who later published her story under the name Linda Brent, spent 7 years hidden in a crawlspace barely 9 feet long and 3 feet high to escape sexual violence from her enslaver. She wrote of the constant fear, the crawling insects, the stifling heat, and the knowledge that even this misery was preferable to the abuses that awaited outside. For many, so-called rest was a brief pause in hardship, not a chance to recover. The midday break, if granted, was a few minutes to swallow cold rations before returning to the fields. The cycle of deprivation was as calculated as the violence, a daily reminder that even a moment's comfort was rationed, controlled, and always at risk of being taken away. At dusk, the slave auction yard filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and hushed voices. Families waited in rows, eyes fixed on the ground, as buyers circled and pointed. A child's hand slipped from her mother's grasp as the auctioneer called her number. The mother reached, only to be pulled back by a rope. Her cries mingled with the bidding. $50, $70, $100. The sale was final. The child led away, her name replaced by a number in a ledger. Records from Richmond and New Orleans show that the sale of children apart from parents was not an exception, but a daily occurrence. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 2/3 of enslaved children in the Upper South were sold away from their families before emancipation. The trauma left no visible scars, but it carved deep wounds. In the 1930s, the DuPA interviewed formerly enslaved mothers who described the moment their children were taken. "They tore my baby from my arms. I never saw her again." One woman whispered, "They say a mother's grief don't last, but I still see his face every night." The psychological toll reached far beyond the auction yard. Modern studies compare the trauma of family separation under slavery to the effects of war or abuse, with symptoms echoing what psychologists now call complex PTSD. The constant threat of separation, never knowing if a loved one would be sold at dawn, created a state of unending anxiety. Children learned not to attach too closely. Parents steeled themselves against hope. Some mothers, forced to watch their children sold, were punished for their grief, lashed for crying too loudly, beaten for refusing to let go. This generational wound did not heal with time. Research on post-traumatic slave syndrome traces patterns of vacant esteem, fractured trust, and generational grief back to these forced separations. The pain was not only private, but public, a spectacle for profit and a warning to others. As night fell on the auction block, the silence that followed was heavy with loss, carried forward in the memories of those who survived and those born in the shadow of that loss. On a January night in 1811, the cane fields of Louisiana erupted in rebellion. Nearly 500 enslaved people, led by Charles DeLand, armed themselves with farm tools and makeshift weapons and marched toward New Orleans. They torched plantation houses and sugar houses along the German coast, gathering more supporters with every mile. White militias and federal troops responded with overwhelming force, killing dozens in the fields and executing at least 44 more after brief trials. Heads of the executed were displayed on pikes for miles along the levee, a warning to others, but also a testament to the scale of resistance. Acts of defiance took many forms beyond open revolt. In 1848, Ellen and William Craft risked everything to escape Georgia. Ellen, light-skinned enough to pass for white, disguised herself as a wealthy, disabled gentleman. William posed as her servant. Together, they traveled by train and steamer through the heart of the slave South, arriving in Philadelphia on Christmas Day. Their journey, meticulously planned and daringly executed, exposed the absurdity of the laws that defined blackness and bondage. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery in Maryland, found freedom in 1849, but returned south at least 13 times. She led more than 70 people to safety, guiding them by night on the Underground Railroad. Tubman carried a pistol and threatened to use it on anyone who lost their nerve, knowing that hesitation could mean death for all. Slave catchers placed a $40,000 bounty on her head, but she was never captured. Tubman's courage became legend, her name spoken in whispers among those still in bondage. Resistance was not always dramatic or public. Enslaved people broke tools, feigned illness, and sang coded spirituals to share news of escape routes. Each act, whether bold or quiet, chipped away at the system designed to crush them. Even in the face of violence and death, the will to resist endured, proof that no law or lash could extinguish the desire for freedom. The legacy of slavery persists in ways that reach far beyond the fields and auction blocks of the past. In the United States today, the racial wealth gap remains one of the starkest reminders of this unspoken debt. According to the Federal Reserve's 2019 survey of consumer finances, the median white household holds nearly 8 times the wealth of the median black household. This disparity is not a recent development, but the direct result of centuries when black Americans were denied the right to own property, inherit wealth, or benefit from their own labor. Generations of forced labor built fortunes for others, while black families were systematically excluded from land ownership, skilled trades, and access to credit. The trauma inflicted by slavery did not end with emancipation. Modern studies in psychology and neuroscience have documented how the stress of violence, family separation, and constant threat of loss can be passed down through generations. Researchers examining post-traumatic slave syndrome find patterns of anxiety, hypervigilance, and mistrust that echo the survival strategies once necessary under bondage. These patterns are not simply remnants of the past. They are responses to ongoing discrimination and social barriers rooted in slavery's aftermath. The consequences are visible in home ownership rates, educational attainment, and health outcomes. Black Americans are less likely to own homes, more likely to experience chronic health conditions, and face persistent barriers to generational wealth. Even after the civil rights era, redlining, job discrimination, and unequal schools have reinforced the economic gulf first carved by slavery. The wealth gap is not just a statistic. It is a living measure of promises broken and justice deferred, carried by families whose ancestors endured the unimaginable and whose descendants still bear the cost. Of the 12.5 million Africans shipped across the Atlantic, only about 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage, each then facing a daily reality defined by law as property, not person. Records show enslaved people endured 15 to 18-hour workdays, brutal whippings, and the constant threat of family separation, as documented in court cases like Celia's and survivor testimonies from the UPA archives. Despite clear evidence of these horrors, many personal stories remain undocumented. The daily experiences of millions were never written down, and some legal records are lost or incomplete. Today, measurable legacies remain. The racial wealth gap persists, and studies confirm the transmission of trauma across generations. Historians agree that slavery's purpose was to break the human spirit for profit, making survival itself an act of resilience. The facts are undeniable. No modern person could endure the full system of American slavery. To understand this past is to confront its ongoing impact and recognize the